Alright, new CPU release means it's time for another CPU comparison. Even if I'm a little bit late to this one, since getting a hold of a 9950X3D was kinda hard, okay? And you might be thinking, well, there's no point in upgrading from a 7950X3D. I'm not gonna waste your time, because in most cases, you are absolutely right. But don't click off the video, because there's actually some places where we see some really notable gains. And because I have more than just the raw performance to look at. I am also going to be taking a look at the scheduling behavior of AMD's claimed improvements with the 9950X3D. Because if you watch reviews or use one yourself, well, you probably notice that you may sometimes get some weird dips, or you see the highest tier chips start lagging behind the 78 or 98, the 800X3D. Well, a reason for that is because of AMD and how it handles its scheduling with the dual CCD design, which we need to talk about to give a little context behind why I've done from what I have for my tests. In simple terms, things like the 9950X3D are comprised of two CCDs that each have 8 cores. Kind of like two 8-core CPUs glued together. If a process has to reach around to the other CCD for more cores, there can be a latency cost of doing so versus doing it on the same CCD. Now, for big production workloads which heavily need those cores, like say Blender, the latency of that is far outweighed by the extra cores in the threads, which is why you'll see the 9950X3D does so vastly better than the 9800X3D in multi-core workloads. But for something like gaming, VR in particular, where the single-core performance and very low latency is important, this can sometimes wreak havoc on your frames if it is not properly scheduled. But AMD in their brilliance decided that instead of a hardware scheduler, that their high-end chips are going to rely on game mode and the game bar being on with the balanced power plan. But on the 7950X3D, you'd still get ideal performance by disregarding the scheduler entirely and taking manual control of the thread directing. Take an example with DCS, run using the following settings on screen and an extremely heavy test environment specifically designed to stress the CPU. Thanks to Lynx for creating this monstrosity of a mission. This run was with quad views foveated rendering on the 7950X3D. Note only the CPU frame times as GPU frame time measurements are broken with it in FPS VR under a stock install. In this situation, taking manual control to assign the game exclusively to the V cache and everything else to the other CCD had stock behavior having up to a near 10% higher frame time. And remember, lower is better for these. This isn't an on-paper difference either, as we do end up with a measurably higher delivered FPS, though it is not significantly so. However, in VR, where every last bit of performance matters, near double-digit gains is noteworthy. And then there's the cases where even where some of the percentage statistics had everything about the same, if you look at a live graph and moment-to-moment differences, like this slowed down segment from MSFS 2020 with Terrain LOD 200, manual thread control had less red in it, indicating better frame times, and we have slightly higher performance and GPU utilization due to the lightning CPU bottleneck. So, you may be wondering, has the 9950X3D improved on this? Because AMD claimed it has. I'm not going to waste your time. No, it has not. If you want to avoid all these headaches, just skip the 800X3D SKU without the dual CCDs, because there are even more ways you can accidentally screw your performance. Let's look at the 9950X3D now. To illustrate the point, here are 3 VRChat runs in the Udon benchmark world, which can spawn 80 avatars with constraints. First window is stock behavior, second is stock but on high performance power plan, and third is high performance power plan with manual control. Merely toggling on high performance but keeping everything else stock is way worse for the frame times, and it is measurably affecting our FPS because we're becoming CPU bottleneck. Whereas with stock behavior on the balance plan, we're almost entirely limited by my headset's refresh rate, save for a few spikes. And taking manual control gets some ridiculous performance where we are entirely Hertz limited and fully GPU bottlenecked. But here's the thing, if you don't play a popular game where Game Bar doesn't auto-detect it as a game, you can get things like this with Alien Rogue Incursion, where you have to add remember this is a game. On the 7950X3D, performance gets absolutely kneecapped because it's prioritizing the frequency core with Alien Rogue Incursion using quad views and DX11. So, if you ask me, AMD's scheduling is shit, and due to how variable it made some results, particularly during sudden CPU spikes, I've elected to ignore it and use manual control for these tests instead, as I've already shown 4 different games with notable issues or leaving performance on the table by not doing so. However, this is very easy to do with free software where you rarely need to do anything yourself, just set up once and you can forget about it, or just very minimal involvement. So let's talk about my testing methodology and configuration for how I set up these CPUs for optimal performance. For manual control, what I recommend is going into the BIOS, saying prefer frequency so that by default processes will go into the frequency CCD, then, and this is very important, disable game mode because it turns off AMD's scheduling so you won't get two schedulers trying to fight each other over what to do. I use the high performance power plan as well, but you don't have to. For anyone really wanting to be lazy about it, you can just use the Windows Task Manager to find Steam or whatever game launcher you primarily use and manually assign the core affinity to 0 to 15. This will make basically every game launch through Steam or whatever launcher you use inherit the Infinity Mask automatically. Only one game I have seen which has not respected this has been Pavlov at about like 100 VR games and then a huge number of flat screen games too. Downside to this is you will have to do it every single time you restart the program. Alternatively, you can just use Process Lasso, which is what I use to make some programs automatically get an Affinity Mask on startup, and after the one-time initial setup, you never need to worry about it again because it can just give you finer control with less hassle and will do everything for you. These give exclusive access to the Vcache cores for the game for optimal performance, while everything else just stays the hell out of the way. Now, test configuration wise, I have the 7950 X3D and 9950 X3D, RTX 5090 running PCIe Gen 4 mode, 64 gigabytes of 6000 MHz DDR5 RAM, and I'm running on the Pimax Crystal here at 4312 by 5100 per eye, unless noted otherwise, at 120 Hz mode, minus the slight performance penalty on the GPU side from recording. In two games, I've also tested quad views based foveated rendering, which renders a much smaller focus view at full fidelity and then a much lower resolution peripheral view. This can significantly improve GPU performance, but it also adds quite a bit of load onto the CPU since geometry is drawn twice in the overlapping regions, making for it a pretty good test here. With my chosen measuring tool FPS VR here, however, it interacts with Steam and Steam VR. It breaks the GPU frame time measuring under stock install behavior, but CPU frame times, they seem to work perfectly fine. And speaking of, I'm going to be doing this a little bit differently than my prior benchmark videos, as this is a CPU comparison, not a GPU, and FPS VR provides a lot better insight into the metrics on that kind of part. With how VR works, it's easier to measure the GPU and CPU frame times independently to see how long each part is working on something. And if your CPU frame times are higher than your GPU frame times, you're most likely CPU bottleneck. Though, per the word of the developer, this isn't an ironclad rule, and I've seen cases myself where changing the GPU load noticeably affected the reported CPU frame times. So, that said, I have tried to focus on situations where better CPU performance caused a measurable increase to FPS while still having some mostly realistic settings, because it was actually really hard to find things where I was CPU bottlenecked in, and the frame times made it a bit easier to test with realistic settings rather than just drop everything and to low with a very low resolution. Though, I did have to raise some settings to a little out of what people might usually use in order to create a proper CPU bottleneck. FPS VR CPU frame times are still probably the best tool most end users will have access to in order to measure this bottleneck. Though frame times are not an exact one-to-one comparison with FPS, you can kind of think of it a little bit like 120 FPS corresponds to 8.3 milliseconds, 90 FPS is 11.1 milliseconds, 60 FPS is 16.6 milliseconds, and 30 FPS is 33.33 milliseconds, also known as Dear God, why? If we've got frame times equal or lower to 8.3 milliseconds, then that means that the part can deliver the max FPS to my headset here since its max refresh rate is 120 Hz, assuming some other parts, like the GPU for example, are not the bottleneck in holding back the whole rendering pipeline. The crops also may be slightly different since I had to recreate them on a new Windows install. Now, this all out of the way, let's get to the benchmarks, shall we? Up first is MSFS 2020 above New York with clear skies, photogrammetry enabled and medium settings, but LOD set to 200 and object detail to 100 with DLSS performance to truly stress the CPU. At the start here, we can already see some differentiation. The 9950 X3D is largely keeping its frame times under 10 milliseconds in this lighter area, and actually giving us several more FPS. This improvement is reflected in the overall statistics too, as the 9950 is doing about 2 milliseconds better. If we speed up a bit to get much closer to the ground, though, the 7950 X3D starts to falter a lot more significantly, with FPS dipping into the mid-60s and GPU utilization in the 80s. The 9950X3D is still beginning to buckle, but it is still consistently keeping several FPS more and higher GPU utilization, resulting in FPS around 9 to 10% higher at times, and overall frame times can reach over 20% improved. A strong start for pushing such a high terrain LOD. And now we have Skyrim VR with the March 15th update of Mad God's Overhaul, running 0.58 render scale with the FSR mod and DLAA under the transformer model. This one was kind of difficult to judge due to the overall consistent frame time spikes, which I only noticed with DLAA enabled, so I don't want to draw exact comparisons due to the inconsistencies. However, I still want to make some broad strokes ones for something which you may have already noticed, and I do think is notable enough to point out. The 9950X3D generally tends to have much more controlled spikes compared to the 7950. Both sometimes do get spikes, yes, but on the newer CPU, they tend to be fewer and less severe in magnitude. Inside the headset, this results in a noticeably smoother experience and is reflected in the lows, where the newer chip is doing around 4 to 6 milliseconds better. The highest gap, the 0.1%, has the 7950X3D's frame times a whole 30% higher than the newer processor, as it's just handling those sudden and unexpected spikes way more consistently. And this isn't a rare difference most people won't notice, particularly in the beginning. This kind of stutter happens often enough to be disruptive to the experience, despite the fact the vast majority of the time we are GPU limited, not CPU. Yes, this 9950X3D isn't immune to these dips, but it is a nice and measurable improvement, not just an on-paper difference. Once more, I do want to stress though, I didn't see this to anywhere near as crazy a degree when not using the DLA transformer model, native res, or upscaling with FSR. So it may be something to do with that, as I know some people modded in DLSS for an earlier version of MGO, and some did mention some frame time dips, which I'm seeing here. And next up is DCS and foveated rendering benchmarks, which in case you skipped the intro was run on these settings using a mission with a predetermined autopilot path and not a replay to help ensure consistency, alongside a couple hundred units, to quote the maker, so as to really tax the system. Without using quad views, we are very much GPU limited, so there's not a whole lot to discuss here, but it's still worth pointing out the 9950X3D has a moderate edge in frame times, about 17 to 18% in the median and 1%, but the 0.1% low is only 7% improved. It doesn't really do anything for us though because of being profoundly GPU limited, and this is a CPU test. We gain nothing by using the 9950X3D, so let's move on and jump over to the quad views test, since that adds a brutal CPU load. Using quad views foveated rendering, the CPU is under a lot more stress, and during points of the benchmark, we actually ping back and forth between CPU and GPU limited, though we do not appear to be that significantly limited even on the 7950X3D. But in frame times, the 9950X3D is kicking the other CPU's ass. We actually have a lot more green than yellow at the start, and moving into some heavier sections, the 9950 is hovering around the mid 9 milliseconds range, while the 7950 is up as high as 11 to 12 milliseconds. We're talking about almost 30% higher frame times in this moment than the newer generation. Note the GPU frame times break with FPS VR using this, but the current and average FPS metrics do appear right testing with other tools. And lightening this CPU bottleneck enables us to be almost fully GPU limited to where we're sometimes getting about 10 FPS more. This is such to the point that we actually managed to briefly go above 90 on the 9950X3D despite these ridiculous settings. The older CPU has frame times around 23 to 26% higher than the newer one, and though the real world difference isn't that significant due to GPU limitations, there are a few sections of the scene where the FPS improves by double-digit margins, and that's even in the average FPS since it's 9% higher with the 9950X3D. That is in no way world-changing, but every last frame can matter in VR, and the 9950X3D would have an easier time getting a stable 90 FPS here since it's easier to drop settings which affect the GPU versus the CPU with more room to customize. So it's a small but meaningful gap with how important thresholds are to hit in VR. And we're moving on to Alien Rogue Incursion, run on epic settings with dynamic res disabled using quad views foveated rendering. Do note, to enable quad views, this requires the -DX11 launch command, and this game is used by default with DX12, which does have better CPU performance, but I am trying to stress it here under conditions some people may actually use. And the 9950X3D is doing quite significantly better. The new generation is comfortably at around 80 FPS, while the older one is largely stuck around the mid-60s. In terms of frame times, the 7950s are 18 to 37% higher than the new chip, with the largest margin being the median frame time and that 37%. We're not seeing that absurd a number reflected in the real-world gains and are still lightly CPU bottlenecked on the 9950, but it's giving us 24% higher average FPS, which is quite the meaningful impact. But speaking of real-world, I want to illustrate just how badly quad views can hit the CPU, and it may not always be beneficial here. Let's take a look at the 7950X3D running in native DX12 mode without it. We are now fully GPU bottlenecked, and in this case, using quad views is actually a detriment to the experience, likely since the game is more optimized for DX12. So in this case, it doesn't matter how much better a CPU we got, it is not the limiting factor without quad views. However, this is also on the 5090, and while I don't have any footage, unfortunately, when I tested this game on the 4090 way back, it did get pretty banged up at native. So with a weaker GPU, quad views could very well be beneficial, and on the 9950X3D, performance is roughly the same with or without it, so it being worth it could just depend on that scene. But at least right now, in terms of real-world applications, we're not really getting that much out of the CPU upgrade. Now, for this next one with VRChat, I do want to stop and put a small disclaimer here real quick, because I know some people are going to take this out of context or skipped over here. You remember my disclaimer about the dev of FPS VR saying we can't know exactly how much time is spent rendering on the CPU? Remember this before you take a screenshot of what you're about to see and say the 9950X3D is up to 5x better than the old chip, please. Okay, so now that out of the way, here's the VRChat run in Udon benchmark world in a spot that lets you spawn 80 avatars with constraints, or on max settings with MSA 8x2. And yeah, it's kinda ridiculous. The 7950X3D is getting blown out of the water here. Just look at the average FPS. The 9950X3D is delivering about 27% more frames because it's far less CPU limited. In fact, we're now Hertz limited by not being able to go above 120 FPS. The 9950X3D has a few points where the frame times spike up relative to the rest of the graph, but as a whole, it's not even sweating. The 7950X3D, though, has a far more yellow than green graph versus the newer chip, which has almost nothing but green. I checked out the results multiple times, both with and without manual masking. The numbers always checked out, but I'm still struggling to believe how much better the 9950 is doing than its younger brother here. This is the only test anywhere where I saw this remotely ridiculous kind of increase if we check just the frame times. So I don't know if it's just because the same avatar spawned 80 times, the fact we're hitting a near locked 120 FPS finally, or it's something else. The lows are, by frame times, 56 to 60% worse on the 7950X3D, and the median frame time was 500% higher. I don't think there's anything I could find that actually had me so CPU bound in gaming I could reflect that in a real world difference. So again, I don't want to get too fixated on the frame time improvements here due to those disclaimers, but what's very real is that we're getting about 25 more FPS on average, and that's quite noticeable in VR, especially when it brings you to your HMD's refresh rate. One thing worth pointing out is that 120 FPS, the 5090 is getting some rare stutters the lower FPS runs just don't have. This is likely the micro stutter issue I've mentioned in some previous videos. FPS VR does seem to be picking it up now. It has had some beta updates, and since I said it didn't appear to. Still some really bizarre results I'd like somebody else to corroborate, but VRChat's had a version update since I ran this. So if somebody does try to replicate this, I can't guarantee that it won't have affected the results. Well, some of those results were, pretty surprising, huh? But before the overall conclusion, I do want to stress something and why I didn't show some more games. Because with basically every other single game I tested, I was so incredibly far from CPU bound, even on a 7950X3D, that it didn't matter. And I would be wasting everyone's time showing a bunch of games. And it's not just a case of, oh, it'd help you do 144 hertz if your headset has that or something. No. This is Automobilista 2 with the 7950X3D and the 5090 with 21 cars and high settings, with medium MSAA and optional settings like enhanced mirrors turn on. And the CPU frame times are, with a few occasional spikes, hovering around 4.7 to 5.7 millisecond range. 144 FPS takes 6.9. 5.7 milliseconds would be good up for 175 if that's all accurate. Yes, this is a replay, but I did live races too. Same results on the CPU. It was not stressed at all. And besides the games I showed here, this was generally how it looked worst case for the 7950X3D. Or I was just so significantly GPU bound and the CPU frame times could go up waiting for that to finish its work despite only being GPU bound. And that's a racing sim I just showed too. Most games were often way less and in the only a couple millisecond range at most, which makes me worried if some of the numbers will be accurate because, I mean, look at how VRChat was once we hit a capped 120 FPS. The only real exception I would have liked to test would have been MSFS 2024 with quad views, but it added that right as I finished all my testing and the 7950X3D was all packed up and going away. And that all brings me to my overall conclusions, which I can make very short. Can there be cases where the 900X3D series improvements provide some pretty significant uplifts over the prior gen? Oh, definitely. Where it mattered, we saw multiple cases of 20% or greater uplift, not just in frame times, but in actually delivered FPS too. And though this is above the average most reviewers have found, it's not unprecedented where some games can punch above that average, per AMD's own slides and some reviewers, like Gamers Nexus testing Baldur's Gate 3, who found about a 22% increase there. But I want to reiterate, unless you're playing some of the most CPU-intensive tasks possible for VR, like VRChat and ultra-populated lobbies or quad views, the prior Gen X 3D chips handle the vast majority of tasks with room to spare. And if you do want one of the AM5X3D processors, most people really should just get the 7800X3D or the 9800X3D. Those don't have to faff about with the core parking nonsense and the manual control. As because AMD Scheduler is still not great, it creates issues for those multi-CC designs, and even when it does work right, you are sometimes getting double-digit gains by taking manual thread control. If you do get one of these dual CCD chips because you are a madman who needs the absolute best performance, or do a chunk of production stuff alongside gaming, like me, you will save yourself a lot of trouble or headache using manual control. And it's really not that hard to do. And if you're already on the 7800 or 7950X3D, unless you play a lot of the games I tested here and need every last drop of performance, well, even with being a drop-in upgrade, I'd probably just skip it. Save it for a better GPU. Your CPU can absolutely still matter in VR. I had another video on the 12900K versus 7950X3D checking some similar stuff, but we're well into the point where, for most cases, any recent upper-end CPU will have you more than covered. Especially the X3D chips, those things are just a marvel. But there are a few cases where even the 9950X3D could still want some room for more performance. So if you need it, well, it's there. Anyway, there is the video. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching and consider subscribing for more, as I should have the crystal super soon to look at. But if not, well, maybe I'll see you again sometime in the recommendeds later. Bye.